The fog over the Seine clung to the quays like a living presence, dense enough to blur the lamplight into trembling halos, yet thin enough for the faint silhouette of a man in a bowler hat to be seen crossing the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a sharp, nervous cry, breaking again and again into the silence, echoing against shuttered windows. To some it was nothing, a stray cur, frightened by shadows. But to Maigret, standing motionless at the Quai des Orfèvres window, with his heavy pipe unlit between his teeth, it carried the weight of an omen. That bark seemed to pierce through the quiet, pointing toward an unease that was less about the animal than the silence it disrupted, the silence of a city hiding something just out of reach. Cases often began this way, not with a telegram, not with a corpse, but with a sound, a tremor, a ripple disturbing the still water of ordinary life. And in that ripple, Maigret could already sense the contours of a mystery yet unseen, a shadow lying in wait for him in the narrow streets of Paris. The fog clung heavily to the quays, thicker than usual for an autumn evening, muffling the clatter of horse hooves and softening the glow of the street lamps until they were no more than pale, trembling discs in the darkness. From the open window of his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret leaned slightly forward, pipe between his teeth, his gaze fixed on the Seine. The water moved sluggishly, unseen beneath the curtain of mist, but its smell rose unmistakable, damp, metallic, tinged with coal dust. He was not a man to indulge in premonitions, yet something in the weight of the night pressed down on him, an almost physical sensation of expectancy. Then it came, sharp, insistent, a bark that cut through the silence with uncanny clarity. It was not a single cry, but several, staccato and ragged, echoing strangely in the fog, bouncing off the facades of shuttered buildings. Maigret drew in his breath, the stem of his pipe held motionless against his teeth. A dog in Paris was nothing extraordinary. Mongrels roamed the markets, watchdogs guarded warehouses along the canal, but the sound carried something else. It was not anger nor joy, but unease, as though the animal had caught sight of something menacing and invisible to human eyes. He closed the window with deliberate calm, turned, and filled his pipe slowly from the worn pouch in his pocket. The flame of the match flared, then dimmed, the room filling with the familiar comfort of tobacco smoke. He returned to his desk, where papers lay in ordered stacks, reports of petty thefts, brawls, a forged signature on a cheque in the Marais. Routine, tedious, the kind of police work that weighed on his younger inspectors far more than on him. Yet behind the neat columns of handwriting, Maigret sensed the pulse of the city, the quiet beat of lives intersecting in ways that sometimes erupted in violence. The bark came again, more distant now, carried across the river perhaps, or from some alley that opened toward the quay. He set down his pen, staring at the window, as though he might see through the fog. Silence returned, thicker for the interruption. Maigret tamped the bowl of his pipe with his thumb and thought, not for the first time, that the city itself had a way of speaking, through its noises, its sudden pauses, through the restless shuffling of its inhabitants. And tonight Paris spoke through the uneasy cry of a dog. A knock at the door broke the thought. Without rising, Maigret called out, his voice deep, almost weary. Lucas entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair plastered to his skull by the damp night air. He carried his hat in one hand, the other holding a slip of paper. "A telegram, Chief," Lucas said, his tone neutral, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Maigret extended a hand, unfolded the flimsy sheet, and read the brief message. The words were few, typed unevenly, the signature smudged by haste. "Disappearance. Urgent. Small town near Melun. Station master insists. Request police presence." No name given, no details, just the urgency that clung to the words like the fog outside. He let the paper rest on the blotter for a moment, smoke curling slowly from his pipe. Disappearance. The word could mean anything: a man drunk and gone to ground in a mistress's room, a child strayed into the woods, a traveller who had boarded the wrong train. And yet, why the urgency? Why the telegram sent so late in the evening? Lucas shifted his weight, waiting. The office clock ticked heavily, the only sound besides the faint murmur of the river. Maigret finally said, "Janvier is still here?" "Yes, Chief. He's finishing reports in the next room." "Tell him to prepare. We leave on the morning train." Lucas nodded, slipped the telegram back into its envelope, and withdrew, closing the door with a soft click. Alone again, Maigret leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long plume of smoke. His eyes moved to the map on the wall, the intricate web of rail lines stretching outward from Paris like veins from a heart. Melun. He pictured the landscape, the small towns clustered along the Seine, the damp smell of the riverbanks, the slow life of inns and barges. He had passed through often enough, always noting the same air of stubborn provincial reserve. A disappearance there would not be spoken of lightly. The bark returned in his memory, sharper than before, and he found himself imagining a deserted street in such a town, a courtyard with shuttered windows, a dog straining at its leash, frightened by something the townsfolk refused to see. He shook the thought away, annoyed with himself. He was not a poet. He was a police commissaire, grounded, in fact, in evidence, in the solid weight of testimony. Yet experience had taught him that atmosphere often spoke first, before the facts lined themselves in order. He rose, heavy-set but graceful, and crossed to the window again. The fog had thickened, pressing against the glass, hiding the world beyond as though Paris itself had ceased to exist. Somewhere in that opaque darkness, men and women continued their small dramas, lovers quarrelling, clerks trudging home, thieves slipping into shadows. And somewhere, perhaps at that very moment, the story of the telegram was unfolding. A station master pacing, a family distraught, a town murmuring behind closed doors. He turned down the gas lamp, shrugged on his overcoat, and locked the drawer of his desk with its brass key. The corridor outside was nearly deserted, the smell of stale ink and dust heavy in the air. From another office came the scratch of a pen, the murmur of an inspector speaking to himself as he tallied figures. Maigret's footsteps echoed as he descended the worn stone staircase, each step carrying him closer to the damp night outside. The fog wrapped him immediately, cool and clammy against his face. The lantern at the gate cast only a feeble glow, swallowed by the mist within a few paces. He crossed the cobbled courtyard, hearing the faint hiss of the gas lamps, the muted creak of wood as a barge shifted against its moorings on the river. Again a dog barked, this time nearer, startlingly close, as if the animal itself had followed him from the thought to the key. He paused, pipe clenched between his teeth, scanning the mist. But nothing moved, only silence, impenetrable and waiting. Madame Maigret would be awake still, he thought, waiting in their apartment above the boulevard Richard Lenoir, her sewing basket on her lap, the clock ticking in the quiet room. He would return to her as he always did, carrying with him the smell of tobacco and the weight of unsaid thoughts. She would not ask, and he would not explain, for between them silence had long ago become a form of understanding. The bark came once more, distant now, fading into the maze of alleys behind the quay. Maigret pulled his coat tighter, set his hat firmly on his head, and began to walk. Each step sounded hollow in the fog, the city around him reduced to the rhythm of his own tread. Somewhere ahead lay Melun, the missing man or woman, the anxious station-master, the half-spoken rumours that would lead inevitably to some confrontation with truth. But for now there was only the fog, the bark of the unseen dog, and the weight of a mystery that had not yet revealed its face. And Maigret, pipe smoke trailing faintly behind him, walked steadily into the night. The knock came late, not at the Quai des Orfèvres, but at the apartment on the Boulevard Richard Lenoir, when the street was emptied of everything but the whisper of wheels and the sigh of shutters settling into the night. Madame Maigret had set aside her sewing and was tidying the small table when the faint rap sounded, diffident yet insistent, the kind of knock made by someone who already regrets the errand that brought him. She looked toward her husband, who sat with his pipe, unlit, as though the fog he had brought home in his coat had followed him upstairs and settled quietly in the room. Without rising, he said softly, "It will be for me," and the words had the weary patience of a man for whom such hours were not unusual. On the landing stood the concierge, a shawl over her shoulders, and beside her a man in a worn overcoat, hat damp with mist, eyes reddened by travel. He held his hat in both hands with a grip that made the knuckles seem pale as porcelain. "Monsieur le Commissaire," he began, and the voice was hoarse, provincial, carrying the caution of someone not used to the city's thresholds. "I am Arnaud Pommier, station-master of Saint-Mesmin-sur-Seine, near Melun. I sent the telegram an hour ago. They told me I could not expect a reply before morning. I took the late local, and, please forgive me, I thought it better to come." Maigret stood back so the man could enter, a brief glance passing between husband and wife, an exchange of understanding that needed no words. Madame Maigret went to put water on the stove, moving with the quiet economy of a woman accustomed to midnight callers and to her husband's manner with them. The room smelled faintly of boiled wool and tobacco. Pommier remained near the door as if he feared to leave himself without retreat, eyes darting from the mantel clock to the commissaire's face. "Sit," Maigret said, not unkindly. "You'll take something hot." He waited until the man had perched on the edge of the chair, hat still knotted in his hands, then asked, "You spoke of a disappearance." Pommier swallowed and nodded. "Since yesterday evening. A man everyone knows in the town, Victor Larcher. He deals in grain, travels along the river, keeps accounts for some of the mills. Not a rich man, but respectable. At 9 o'clock he should have boarded the down train for Melun. He did not. Or if he did, he was not seen arriving. His valise was left in my office. I found it after closing." The commissaire's pipe remained unlit between his fingers. He watched the station-master with that heavy immobility that made witnesses feel their words settling around them like dust in a ray of light. "You are certain the valise was his?" It was old, with his initials pressed into the leather. V.L. The clasp, you see, is loose. He always complains of it. Pommier drew in a breath, the air lifting his shoulders. "I have known him 10 years. We are not friends. He is a private man. But in a small place, one knows the way another man walks the time he keeps the smell of his pipe. He did not leave his valise by mistake." Madame Maigret placed a steaming cup before the visitor. The man bowed his head in thanks and then hovered his hands over the heat, like someone warming himself at a brazier on a platform. "There were other signs," he went on, and the words came more quickly now that he felt heard. "The yard dog Médor at the good siding, he would not stop barking all evening. He is old and mostly sleeps. He was, how to say, on point, but at nothing. Shadows. The fog was thick, the way it is here tonight." "Who else was there?" Maigret asked. "The porter, Laforgue, and the telegraph boy, a quiet one who stammers. 3 or 4 travellers for the 9:30. The innkeeper's wife, Madame Piquet, came to fetch a crate of wine that had come from Sens. And a woman I do not know well, Hélène Maury, who sometimes takes the train to Paris on Wednesdays, she said she had missed her connection. She loitered by the parcel window and asked too many questions about schedules, as if the numbers comforted her. And Larcher? I saw him at 8:20. He came to the office to ask if a letter had arrived. He looked tired. He said something about a missing invoice. Then he smiled, and that small, tight smile he has to show he is not worried. He went outside. After that, nothing. Nothing except the valise. Yes. Was the river fog as thick at the station as it is here? Thicker. It crawled in from the low ground. At times, the lamp over the goods shed was a pale coin, and then it disappeared entirely, as if someone had pinched it out with 2 fingers. Maigret's pipe remained cold. He stood and crossed to the window, where the glass was pearled with damp. He saw again the discs of light along the quay, the unstable halos that made the dark feel alive. "You sent the telegram. Why not wait for the gendarmes?" Pommier tensed, then sighed. "They will come, but they know us too well. Each of us has a brother-in-law or a debt with the other. In a small place one carries one's face like a passport. There is talk, there is reluctance." He glanced up quickly. "Forgive me. There may be nothing. A man can vanish for innocent reasons. But there is a feeling, monsieur, the kind that makes you keep the lamp lit though you cannot say why." "Who would care to profit from his absence?" Maigret asked, not moving from the window. "Some say he owed a little at the Café des Voyageurs. Gaston Raveau keeps the ledger on the shelf, and he is not a patient creditor. There was also a quarrel last week with a bargeman, Rochard, the big fellow who carries sacks for the mills when he is not on the water. Rochard shouted that Larcher had cheated him of a commission. And there is the woman, Hélène Maury, a seamstress, sometimes at the Piquet's Inn on market days. There is talk she visits certain rooms when the shutters are closed." He blushed, ashamed to bring such things into the clean light of the commissaire's sitting room. "A rumour, nothing more." Maigret turned from the window. The room felt close, heavy with steam and the smell of boiled water. He lit his pipe at last. The match haloed in the damp air, and the first puff seemed to settle his features into their usual lines. "You did well to come," he said. "In the morning I will be on the train with Inspector Janvier. We will start at your office, then the inn, then the café. Let the gendarmes do their work and be courteous with them. Say only what you must." Relief loosened the station-master's mouth into a real smile, one that made him look younger by years. "Merci, monsieur le commissaire." He stood awkwardly, and then remembered his hat, which had sat the whole time like an obedient animal on his lap. At the door he hesitated. "There is one more thing. In the goods yard, near the shack where we keep the kerosene, I found a lamp still warm, and the wick half-turned. No one admits to using it." "Leave it as it is," Maigret said. "Post a boy to watch, not a hero, just eyes." After Pommier left, the room seemed to empty twice, once of his body and then of the anxiety he had brought with him. Madame Maigret cleared the cups and set them to dry, her movements neat and soundless. "You will go early," she said, not as a question. "The first from the Gare de Lyon," he replied. He looked at her as though he might explain the dog and the fog and the way these things connected in his head, but he only said, "Sleep," and she nodded, a small smile that gave nothing away and everything at once. The Quai des Orfèvres in the grey before dawn has its own smell, a mixture of damp paper, stale tobacco, and a whisper of river. Maigret walked its corridor with his hat brim low, the building still half asleep, though somewhere a typewriter clattered impatiently against the quiet. Janvier was already waiting, young and eager, collar up, a notebook peeping from his pocket. "Lucas showed me the telegram, Chief," he said. I brought the file on the Larcher name. There's a Paris address, Rue du Parc Royal, 3rd floor, furnished. He keeps it for business when he stays in the city. "Send Lucas to verify it," Maigret said. "No questions to the neighbours yet. Only the state of the room, the papers, any recent letters. We do not want the news to run ahead of us." He took the folded paper Janvier held out. The handwriting labelled Larcher, Victor, grey suit, worn cuffs, medium, 48. Under it, a few notes about a civil dispute 5 years earlier over a lost shipment settled at the prefecture after drinks and apologies. Nothing that would suggest vanishing into fog. They crossed the courtyard together, their footsteps hollow. The fog had not lifted. At the gate, a driver hunched in his coat, the fiacre's breath pluming in the cold in time with the horses. The river was a presence rather than a sight, a thickness in the air that pressed against the arches of the bridges and returned every sound with a dampened echo. On the seat of the cab, Maigret noticed a smear of damp grit, as if a boot had scraped it in impatience. He brushed it with his glove without thinking, sniffed, and found the faint, tarry scent of river barges. The Gare de Lyon at that hour felt like a shell with its creature still sleeping inside. Porters leaned on their trolleys, eyes half closed. A woman with a shawl over her hair sold coffee that tasted of iron and scorch. In the high space under the soot-black beams, birds flickered and scolded, small quarrels lost in the vault. They bought tickets and waited near the gate, not speaking much, each with his own morning quiet. Janvier worried his notebook as a priest worries a rosary. Maigret smoked and watched. A man of 30 with a face like a blunt instrument stood a little apart from the others, watching too intently for someone who had nothing to do. He wore new shoes that pinched and a coat that had once belonged to a larger man. He carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper with string tied too carefully. He met Maigret's gaze for a moment and then looked away, pretending to examine the timetable as if numbers could shield him. The commissaire filed the face where such things were kept, not as a suspect, but as an atmosphere of human intention. There is always someone waiting too sharply at a station. The whistle came thin from the throat of the locomotive, like a bird calling over water. They climbed into a compartment where the cushions were still cold. Opposite them, a woman with a single suitcase pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and studied her own reflection in the black window. In the corner, an old man slept with the fierce concentration of the elderly, chin in collar, breath a slow saw cutting the wood of the morning. The train moved and the fog along the yards broke and slid, revealing and hiding the geometry of tracks, the crouch of sheds, the occasional lamplight caught in a pane like a coin ready to be spent. Paris drifted away by inches, then by streets, then by neighbourhoods that deserved names but gave them up in the grey. Janvier ventured a question, and Maigret answered in monosyllables. He preferred to let the rhythm of the train gather the thoughts for him, to let details settle until the grains arranged themselves into a picture of a face he had not yet seen. When the city loosened into fields, he turned the name Larcher in his mind as one turns a key with stiff teeth. Larcher, with the grey suit and the careful smile, with a valise that complained when it was latched. Larcher, with a room on the Rue du Parc Royal that he used when business called him to Paris. A station lamp left warm by a hand that did not sign its name. The yard dog barking at emptiness, making emptiness, therefore, a presence. The woman, Hélène Maury, with schedules for comfort, and perhaps other comforts for those who paid in cash and secrecy. The big bargeman, Rochard, whose anger was the kind that needed witnesses more than reasons, and the innkeeper's wife, Madame Piquet, moving crates of wine like a woman who could carry a secret as easily as a box. "Chief?" Janvier asked softly, as if afraid to wake the old man or to puncture the fog of his superior's thoughts. "We begin with the station master's office," Maigret said, not opening his eyes. "Then the goods yard. I want to see the lamp and how it stands, what it sees if lamps can be said to see. After that the inn. We will drink something sour and ask nothing that can be answered with pride. Pride is an obstruction. We will walk around it." The compartment rocked, and the smell of coal and damp wood seeped through a crack in the window frame. Maigret allowed himself to drift, but not to sleep. He never slept on the way to a case. The mind, left to itself, became a river that found its own level, carrying bits of reed and driftwood into eddies where they caught and formed the beginnings of islands. He thought of Madame Maigret at her table, of Lucas in a room in Paris bending over a desk to read letters not his, of Pommier at his station with a boy watching a lamp, of a dog that would not be silent because somewhere a silence had been torn open and could not yet be mended. The train slid into a slow curve, the wheels complaining faintly, and in the blur of the glass there was, for a brief second, the ghost of a key, a pale smear that might have been water. He felt the weight of the pipe in his pocket and the steady pull of the day ahead. Outside, the countryside began to gather itself into fields edged with hedges black with dew, into small houses with shutters still closed, into the first hesitant shapes of a town that waited with its cafes not yet awake, and its secrets pressed like hands against its windows from within. Somewhere ahead, the station bell of Saint-Mesmin would be struck with a practised wrist, and the sound would go out over the tracks and die in the low ground where fog lay. He imagined the yard dog raising its head as if to answer, then settling again to guard an absence. He imagined a valise with loose clasp, a lamp still warm, and a man named Victor Larcher who had gone where men go when they step out of their regular path by only the width of a shoe and find the world has no flaw there. He opened his eyes and looked at Janvier, who tucked his pencil away as if a command had been given. The commissaire nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as the train began to slow. The train's brakes shrieked softly as it slowed, and the station at Saint-Mesmin-sur-Seine emerged from the fog like a sketch unfinished, the outlines blurred by the wet air. The lamps on the platform cast their halos over a handful of figures waiting, their faces pale ovals that seemed to float, disconnected from their bodies. Maigret stepped down heavily, his coat collar turned up, Janvier following with a smaller valise and his notebook already half drawn from his pocket. The station-master, Pommier, was there to meet them, hat pulled low, his eyes anxious but relieved, as though the presence of Paris men lent weight to his own unease. "Nothing new since last night," Pommier muttered as they moved together through the damp air toward his office. "But the talk is louder. They whisper at the café and in the grocer's. Some say Larcher had debts, others say he left of his own will. His wife insists otherwise. His office smelled of coal dust and ink, the kind of place where papers are folded with care, but never entirely clean. The valise stood on a chair near the desk, brown leather with corners rubbed pale, its brass clasp loose as Pommier had described. Maigret touched it lightly with his gloved hand, then opened it. Inside were shirts folded neatly, a shaving kit, a ledger with the initials scratched faintly on the cover. All ordinary, and yet the ordinariness itself had a strangeness, as though a life had been interrupted mid-sentence. "His wife?" Maigret asked, looking up from the case. "She is at their house, by the river." It's on the edge of town, near the old ferry road. She has not slept. She will want to speak to you." The commissaire nodded, closing the valise and leaving it as it was. He walked to the window that overlooked the yard. The fog hung in tatters over the tracks, and beyond it, the goods shed loomed like a shadow with a lantern clinging weakly to its corner. "Show me the lamp you mentioned." They crossed the yard, boots echoing on damp boards, the silence disturbed only by the sudden flutter of a pigeon from the rafters. At the far end stood the small shack where kerosene was kept. Inside, on a crate, sat the lamp, its chimney clouded with soot, its wick blackened but not cold. Maigret bent to feel the metal with his palm. "Still faintly warm," he murmured. "Someone trimmed it after you, Pommier." The station master's face tightened. "I swear to you, commissaire, it was warm when I found it." "I don't doubt you," Maigret said, straightening, pipe stem shifting between his teeth, though he had not yet lit it. "But lamps don't light themselves." From the corner came a bark, sudden and sharp. Médor, the yard dog, stood tethered by a chain, his back stiff, hackles raised though nothing stirred in the mist. He barked once, twice, then stopped, staring at the commissaire as though he, too, demanded explanation. Maigret crouched, extending a broad hand. The animal sniffed, growled low in its throat, and then, as if recognizing a presence he could trust, settled back uneasily. They left the station together and walked toward the river. The streets of Saint-Mesmin were narrow, lined with shuttered houses, their plaster walls stained by damp, their roofs bent under years of weather. At this hour, only a few figures moved, women carrying baskets to the bakery, a man with a wheelbarrow of coal. Each turned their head as Maigret passed, curiosity wrapped in silence. He was known already, though he had not spoken a word to them. In towns like this, news spread quicker than trains. The house by the river stood apart, its garden unkempt, a willow leaning over the bank as though tired of its own weight. The shutters were closed on the upper floor, but from the kitchen window below came a thin smoke and the smell of chicory coffee. Madame Larcher received them at the door. She was small, her face drawn, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, yet burning with the kind of determination born from fear. She offered no greeting, only stepped aside so they might enter. The interior was modest but orderly, with the faint odour of river dampness that clung to all the houses along the Seine. On a peg near the door hung a grey jacket, worn at the cuffs. "His," she said quietly, when she saw Maigret's glance. "He wore it yesterday. He did not return to put it on again." They sat in the front room, Janvier discreetly withdrawing his notebook, while Madame Larcher folded her hands tightly in her lap. "He is not the kind to wander," she began, her voice low but steady. "He rises early, keeps his accounts, eats at the same hour, smokes his pipe in the evening. He has habits like the turning of the clock. If he is gone, it is not by his own choosing." "Did he speak of troubles, debts, quarrels?" Maigret asked, his voice heavy, patient. Her mouth tightened. "There is always trouble for men who deal with money, is there not? Someone owes, someone delays. But he is fair. If they quarrelled with his patience, not with his fists. Rochard shouted at him in the street, but he laughed it off when he came home. As for debts, yes, a few, nothing grave. We live simply. And women?" A pause, then her eyes met his squarely. "I have heard the talk. A seamstress who looks too long when he passes. They all talk, but he came home to me." Silence settled. Through the shutters came the muffled cry of a barge horn moving slowly on the river. Maigret leaned back, pipe unlit, studying her face, the weariness that lay under her composure. She held herself taut, as though if she relaxed for a moment, she might collapse. "May we see his room?" She led them upstairs, the boards creaking underfoot. The bedroom was neat, the bed made with heavy covers, the wardrobe half open to reveal folded shirts, a pair of boots. On the nightstand lay a pipe, still faintly smelling of tobacco, as if it had been set down with the intention of being picked up again. The window was ajar, letting in a breath of damp air. On the sill, faint but clear, were smudges where something wet had touched, perhaps a hand, perhaps the edge of a garment soaked in fog. Maigret touched it lightly, then drew back. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room, then returning to Madame Larcher. "You have not moved anything?" "Nothing," she said. Back downstairs he paused at the door, looking out toward the river. Its surface was hidden beneath the fog, but he could hear the slow slap of water against the bank, the chain of a moored barge clinking faintly. He filled his pipe at last, lit it, and drew in the smoke as if to steady himself. Behind them, the town carried on in its muted rhythm, footsteps on cobblestones, a bell ringing somewhere distant, but the house by the river remained heavy with absence, as though Victor Larcher's presence had been lifted away too suddenly, leaving the air unsettled, the silence disturbed. Maigret exhaled smoke and turned to Janvier. "We begin with the inn," he said. "There is always someone who has seen what others deny." And as they stepped back into the fog, the bark of a dog rang out once more, far away, as though reminding them that the silence of Saint-Mémin was not to be trusted. The Café des Voyageurs sat at the bend where the street sloped toward the river, its windows beaded with moisture, its door swollen by the fog so that it needed an extra tug to open. Inside, the air carried the smells of coffee, wine souring in the necks of bottles, damp wool steaming close to the stove. A few men hunched over their glasses, speaking as one speaks when the morning has not yet decided whether it will be ordinary. Behind the counter, Gaston Ravaud wiped at a ring left by a wet glass, as if it were a personal affront. He had the tight mouth of a man who counted more than he trusted, and eyes quick to dart but slow to meet another's squarely. Maigret pushed back his hat and let the warmth take him. He said nothing at first, preferring to listen to the scrape of chairs and the little shifts of silence that follow the entry of a stranger who is not a stranger, a Paris policeman who brings with him an invisible draught that chills conversation. Janvier took a place at a small table, set his notebook on his knee, and waited with the innocence of someone who is at ease just by being useful. Ravaud set 2 cups on the counter, with a clink that sounded like disapproval, and came over, wiping his hands on a towel that never seemed to get cleaner by the wiping. "Monsieur le Commissaire," he said, pronouncing the title as if it were something one might spill and then have to pay for. "Black? No sugar?" "As it comes," Maigret said. He lifted the cup, inhaled the sting of over-roasted chicory, and looked beyond it at the faces in the mirror behind the counter. They were faces that wanted to betray nothing. In mirrors, men often look more honest than in life because they cannot help watching themselves watch you. "You knew Victor Larcher?" Maigret said, almost lazily. Ravaud's shoulders made a small movement that might have been a shrug if he had allowed himself such extravagance. "A client like any other. He drank a glass after supper when he was in town. He owed a little. He paid a little. He was regular." "Regular how?" "The kind who leaves quietly, puts his chair back where he found it, says good evening in a voice that means nothing. I prefer those to the men who make a noise and break things and talk as if a café were a stage." His eyes flicked to the far corner, where a big man with hands like paddles was tracing circles in the condensation on the table with a finger. Rochard did not look up. But regular men, it seems, can also disappear, Poirot said, and his mouth pinched with the idea that habits, like ledgers, should balance. You argued with him last week? Maigret said. That is a word for women, Poirot replied. We discussed. He asked for credit, and I asked for money. He said tomorrow, and I said today is better. He paid 2/3. You may consult my book if numbers speak to you. Numbers often spoke to Maigret, but rarely said more than their owner wanted. And on the night he vanished? He was here at 7. He ate a slice of ham with a pickle and drank nothing stronger than a 1/4 liter of red. He studied the paper like a man trying to find himself in it and failing. He spoke with no one. No one? Janvier asked gently. Ravot's eyes hopped once toward the door, as if checking whether the street might correct him. Madame Piquet came in to ask after a crate. The seamstress, Hélène, had coffee, but lingered as she does, looking at reflections in spoons, making her lips into shapes as if practicing something. Rochard sat there. He jerked his chin toward the big man in the corner, and pretended not to watch anyone. So, no one. Maigret let the silence spread its net, and then reeled it in. Your ledger. Poirot brought it with a flourish of offended pride and laid it open under the commissaire's hand. The entries were rows of careful figures, each name a little world. Larcher, 3 francs, 70 centimes, Maigret read, a debt small enough to be paid with the air in a man's lungs. He turned the page, and the corner rasped. Near the bottom, a smear of ash had pressed into the paper, a crescent the size of a coin. Who smokes caporal here? Everyone, Ravot said. No one. It is the fog that leaves marks. Maigret closed the ledger without haste. Send me word if anything changes, he said, though he knew that what he wanted was not change, but the thing that had been, seen without the fog of memory and fear. They crossed the street to the Piquet's Inn, a squat building with a sign that creaked on 2 iron hooks. The interior was bare, the tables sanded smooth by years of elbows. Madame Piquet appeared from a doorway carrying a tray. She had 4 arms that could lift a cask and a face of stubborn kindness. You've come at last, she said without greeting. I told Arnaud he would not sleep until you did. You saw Larcher? Maigret said, and she nodded. In the afternoon. He was looking for an invoice from the mill at Varennes. He thought it might have been left with a letter in our pigeon box. The drivers sometimes tuck things there if the station is shut. He had that tight smile of his, the one that tells you he is polite because he must be. I gave him a slice of bread and cheese. He ate, standing. The clock struck 3, and he glanced at it as if it had insulted him. And later? Janvier asked. At 7 I sent the boy to fetch the crate from the station. I went myself to see if it had arrived, because one should watch what belongs to one's house. I passed Larcher on the way. He had a valise. He said he would be on the 9:30. After that, the fog was a curtain. You could make shadows do anything behind it. Hélène Maury was here, Maigret said. On and off, Madame Piquet replied, not unkindly weary. She lives 2 streets away with an aunt who hears what she wishes to hear. Hélène sews well enough. She speaks too softly and looks too much at men who do not need looking at. If she had been born in a place with carpets, she would be someone men pay to consider them handsome. In Saint-Mémin, she is a rumour. A door opened, and a slim figure passed in the corridor, a swish of skirt and the quick intake of breath of someone who sees without wanting to be seen. Hélène Maury hesitated at the threshold, then came in because running would have been a confession. She had the pale face of a person who sleeps late and the careful hands of someone practiced at taking exact measurements. Her eyes slid to the commissaire's, then away, then back, like a bird trying to decide if a crumb were a trap. "You missed your Wednesday train," Maigret said. "I changed my mind," she said, voice low and even. "Paris is a city that waits. It will wait another day. You asked many questions about schedules. I like trains," she said, and the smallest smile touched her mouth as if admitting a secret that was not a sin. They are honest when they leave and when they arrive, even if they lie in between. The clocks tell you something you can hold. "Did you speak with Larcher?" "I spoke near him," she said, and Madame Piquet made a small sound like a chair pushed half an inch. "He asked me nothing and I asked him nothing, but we knew of one another the way people do in a small town." He was considerate in his silence. "Considerate how?" "He did not look at me when others did. It is a kindness when someone lets you be only a person." She stood straighter, and the small defiance in the gesture made her seem younger. "He did not vanish because of me." Maigret did not answer. From the street came a clatter of hooves on cobbles, and the flat call of a boy hawking papers that no one would buy because news in Saint-Mesmin preferred to be exchanged face to face. He turned to Madame Piquet. "He left a valise at the station." "He left many things everywhere," she said. "He carried too much in his head and not enough in his hands." The bargeman came later, not because he had been summoned, but because the weight of his own temper made sitting still impossible. Rochard stood in the doorway and filled it, raincoat unbuttoned, to reveal a sweater that might have been knitted for someone larger and then shrunk in bad water. His jaw had the set of a man who greets the world with his teeth. "You want to ask me if I killed him," he said, the words landing like sacks thumped onto a wharf. "I want to ask you why you shouted at him," Maigret said. "Because he cheated me," Rochard replied, as if that were answer enough. "A commission on 3 deliveries from Varennes to the mill at Boissy. He told the miller my price was too high, and they gave the work to a boy who steers with his elbows. He saved a few francs and cost me bread. I told him so where everyone could hear, so that he would be ashamed in his laugh. A man should eat what his hands earn." "And after you shouted?" "I drank. I sleep when I drink. I woke with my tongue like a rope and the world the colour of this place." He gestured at the fog pressed against the panes. "Ask anyone who saw me drinking. Everyone sees me when I drink. That is the trouble with being large." "Did you see him at the station?" "I saw the fog. It is greedy. It eats faces. I heard a dog." His eyes slid to Madame Piquet, then to Hélène, and he shrugged. "Dogs know when something is wrong. Men pretend until morning." When he had gone, the inn felt emptier for his absence, as if a tide that had risen had just dropped, leaving stranded objects where it had been. Maigret stood, paid for the coffee he had not drunk, and asked to see the rooms, because there is a habit, older than police work, that tells you to ask to see rooms where strangers might sleep. Madame Piquet led them up a narrow stair, the walls brushed smooth by years of shoulders. The corridor smelled of old soap and the damp that no window opens wide enough to expel. She opened doors with the no-nonsense movements of a woman who has no time for secrets unless they are useful. Each room was the same, a bed with a sag in the middle, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, a small table, a chair set precisely under it, as if lined up by an invisible string. The last door stuck, and she put her shoulder to it with a muttered apology that was really annoyance at the wood, not at them. The room beyond had the same furnishings as the others, but the air was different, as if someone had recently stood there considering what to do next. On the table, lay a match burnt to its black nub, and beside it a pearl of wax hardened into a tear on the wood. The window was latched, but a seam of fog fingered its way past a defect in the frame and lay like breath on the sill. "Who slept here last?" Maigret asked. "No one this week," Madame Piquet said after a pause, which in such mouths is more eloquent than speech. Or if someone came without paying, they came like ghosts. Maigret moved to the washstand. In the basin, a few dark grains clung where water had dried. He wet his thumb, pressed it to the grains, lifted it to his nose. It smelled of silt and coal, a river's pocket. He looked at the curtains. Along the edge, at height of a man's hand, a faint smear, as if fingers damp with kerosene had brushed aside the fabric. He bent, not a graceful man, but one whose body knows how to obey, and saw on the floor, near the bed leg, a fragment of twine with flattened twists, the kind used to tie parcels in a station office. He placed it on his palm like a small found truth and kept it without comment. Downstairs again the light had changed by a shade that meant the morning had overcome the night only by a degree. He thanked Madame Piquet and said nothing of the room he had just left. Outside, the fog breathed in the slow rhythm of the river. A cart rolled past, the horses' fetlocks dark with damp. A woman shook a rug, and the dust returned to her in the air, as if offended by the attempt to be rid of it. At the station, Pommier met them with a face that had been arranged to say there was no news, but could not help saying that the absence of news was itself news. "The boy watched the lamp," he said. "No one came to the shed." But the dog barked again at nothing, then stopped, as if scolded by someone we did not hear. Maigret looked past him to the tracks where the rails disappeared into white, like thoughts not yet ready to be had. He thought of the room at the inn, and the little tear of wax, the twine, the smear in the curtain. He thought of Hélène's voice and her practised composure, of Ravot's numbers lined like men on drill, of Rochard's rage that made a noise, but not, perhaps, a plan. He thought of the valise with its shirts folded like little loyalties. He thought of the window in Larcher's bedroom ajar to the river breath and the smudge on its sill. "Chief," Janvier prompted, quiet as a hand on a sleeve. "We will look again where a man's life should be and is not," Maigret said. "An empty place speaks if you ask it in the right voice." They crossed the yard, the gravel damp and squeaking under their boots, and turned toward the path that led back along the bank to the Larcher house. Médor barked once behind them, not sharply this time, but with the tone of a dog tired of warning men who will only understand after the fact. The willow by the Larcher garden drooped its lashes into the fog. The house stood without expression, shutters still closed like lids over eyes that refused to open. In the upstairs room where they had been, the air was cooler now, and the smudge on the window-sill had darkened, as if the damp had coaxed it into revealing more of itself. Maigret stood very still, the pipe against his lower lip but not yet between his teeth, and listened to the room the way he had listened to the café. Its quiet, its small clicks of wood, its particular silence that was not emptiness but a fullness of something withheld. He stepped to the wardrobe and opened it fully. On the shelf, folded linen, precise as the creases on a uniform. Beneath, the boots, one polished, one dulled by a film of dried mud. He lifted the dull one and turned it. Along the edge of the sole, a rim of dried silt speckled with coal grit, the same smell as in the wash-basin of the inn-room. He replaced it exactly, and turned to the bed, where the covers lay tight as if tightened twice, once by a woman's early habit, and once by a hand that wished to erase the impression of lying there. "What do you see?" Janvier asked, because youth needs names for its hunches. "A path a man took between here and a room that should have held someone anonymous and did not, Maigret said, and a light that was trimmed so that a hand could see to tie something that should have been tied in daylight. They descended the stairs. Madame Larcher met them in the hall, her hands clasped too tightly, colourless at the knuckles. "You have found something," she said, not as a plea, but with the resignation of a woman who knows that all findings are the beginning of losses. "Only that we must look more closely," Maigret answered. At the threshold he paused and considered the garden where the willow trailed its thin branches in the mist. A small path of trodden grass angled toward the old ferry road, barely a path at all, more the idea of one. He looked at it, then at Janvier, and the younger man nodded and went to test the ground with the tip of his shoe. The earth gave a little. A shallow print took water as a mouth takes a word. Somewhere on the river a horn sounded nearer now, as if a barge had come to anchor where it might watch without being seen. Above them, the room they had left kept its counsel. Ahead, the empty places waited with their stubborn truths. The fog thinned for a moment, and then closed again, and the dog, far away, barked once, as if to mark the turn of a page that no one yet read aloud. The stair creaked beneath Maigret's weight as he climbed once more to the Larcher bedroom, that square of silence on the upper floor of the house by the river. Madame Larcher had withdrawn to the kitchen, her presence downstairs like a heartbeat muffled by walls, leaving the commissaire and Janvier alone with the air that seemed too carefully folded, like sheets pressed smooth to conceal the imprint of absence. Maigret paused in the doorway, hat in hand, pipe stem between his teeth unlit, and let the stillness settle over him. He did not move at once. He rarely did in such places. He believed in the eloquence of silence, in the way a room spoke if one listened, with the patience of someone unafraid of quiet. The bed stood as before, blankets tucked with domestic precision, the pillow without indentation. Yet the neatness was almost too emphatic, as if created by hands that wished to erase the sign of use. Janvier ran a finger along the wardrobe's edge, drew it back with a faint trace of dust, and then scribbled a note in his book. "The boots again, Chief?" he asked. Maigret lifted one of them, the duller of the pair, and set it upon the window ledge where the light, muted through fog, revealed its flaws. He traced with his thumb the hardened line of silt caught in the seam, the coal grit like black sugar embedded in the leather. "The river," he murmured. "But not here, not at this bank. Too much coal." He replaced it carefully, then drew the curtains open. Outside, the garden sloped toward the Seine, its willows bending, the river itself invisible beneath the pale weight of mist. The sound of water reached them faintly, a slow wash against stone. He turned back into the room. On the table by the bed lay the pipe Victor Larcher had left. Its bowl carried the ghost of burned tobacco, cold now, but still pungent. Maigret held it close to his nose. "This was smoked recently," he said. "Not days ago." He put it down as if he would return for it. Janvier bent to examine the window-sill. The faint smudges remained, darker with moisture drawn from the fog. "Do you think he left this way, Chief?" Maigret did not answer at once. He crossed to the wardrobe again, opened it, and ran his hand behind the hanging clothes. His fingers found only plaster wall, chill and smooth, no hollow. He closed it, eyes lingering on the shirts folded neatly, their edges precise. Too precise, as if placed by someone unfamiliar with domestic order, but imitating it, copying what seemed correct. He sat heavily in the chair, pipe finely lit, smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. "Rooms like this," he said quietly. "They tell you what they lack. There should be a coat here, one he wore often, And it is not. There should be the clutter of a man's habits, papers, loose coins, a newspaper folded on the chair. There is none of it. Only what is meant to be seen. Janvier frowned. So someone arranged it? Or he himself before going somewhere he knew might change things? Maigret drew in the smoke, exhaled slowly. The valise left at the station, the pipe left on the table, the room tidied too tightly. Each piece says this man was interrupted. The question is by whom? They descended once more, the boards groaning under their steps. Madame Larcher looked up from her seat by the stove, her hands clenched in her lap, eyes hollow with waiting. "You saw?" she asked, voice more statement than question. "We saw," Maigret replied, his tone grave but not unkind. "Tell me, madame, who else entered his room these last days?" "No one," she said. "I keep the house. He does not like others to disturb his things." "Not even Hélène Maury?" Her lips pressed tight. "I hear the talk. I see the way she watches. But he did not bring her here. He was not that kind of man." She faltered, the word corrected too late, and her eyes filled. Maigret inclined his head, not pressing further. He and Janvier stepped back into the fog-drenched garden, the cold air tightening around them like damp cloth. The path by the willow stretched toward the old ferry road, faint prints still visible where the grass had been pressed. The commissaire stooped, touched one with his broad hand. "Not boots," he muttered. "Shoes, narrow, pointed, a woman's perhaps, or a man vain enough to wear them." Janvier knelt beside him. "Fresh?" "The fog preserves but also erases," Maigret said. "Hard to tell, but they lead toward the road, not the river." They followed slowly, the path narrowing between hedges until they reached the bank where the ferry once had crossed. The hut stood abandoned, its planks grey with age, roof sagging. Inside lay a scattering of straw, damp and mouldy. Maigret bent to pick up a stub of candle hardened to the floor, its wick blackened but recent. "Someone waited here," he said, "not long ago." The river's voice grew louder in the silence. From beyond the fog came the distant drone of a barge horn, then the hollow slap of water against a hull. The commissaire's heavy face betrayed nothing, but his pipe glowed steadily, each puff measured, as though he weighed possibilities with every draw. Returning through the village, they passed again by the inn. Madame Piquet stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching them approach. She said nothing until they were near. Then, "The wife is proud. She will not tell you what everyone knows." "And what does everyone know?" Maigret asked, pausing, smoke rising between them. "That Larcher kept a room here once a week, sometimes more. He said it was for work, for papers he did not wish to carry home. But papers do not leave wax on tables, commissaire, nor do they breathe heavy at midnight." Hélène Maury. Her shrug was both dismissal and confirmation. She came often, at times when her aunt said she was sewing elsewhere. A woman knows these things without asking. Janvier's pencil scratched in his notebook. Maigret's eyes stayed fixed on Madame Piquet's, and she did not flinch. "And lately?" he asked. "Lately he was restless. His laugh was thinner. He spoke less. Perhaps he was afraid, though he did not say of what. The last time he left here, he turned at the corner as if to see who followed, but no one did, or if they did, the fog kept them kindly hidden." The commissaire moved on without reply, his bulk vanishing slowly into the mist, Janvier hurrying behind. At the station, Pommier awaited, his face lined with sleeplessness. "Chief," he said, lowering his voice, "a boy who works the barges swears he saw Larcher near the canal 2 nights ago, speaking with Rochard. But when I pressed him, he changed his tale, said he might have mistaken the man in the fog. Convenient, Maigret said. Fear makes witnesses blind, or perhaps money does. They entered the telegraph office, a narrow room with the clatter of keys muffled by fog-thickened windows. On the counter lay a slip of paper, half crumpled. Janvier smoothed it, read aloud. Parcel, Boissy Mills, collection delayed. Signed, VL. Maigret studied it, eyes narrowed. Not his hand, too hurried, too jagged. Someone forged it to explain an absence. The inspector glanced at him. Then he has gone against his will. Maigret said nothing, only folded the slip and slid it into his pocket. His pipe had gone out, but he did not relight it. He stood by the window, staring out into the fog where the dog's bark once more split the silence, shrill, insistent, as if pointing again toward what men refused to see. The empty room, the smudged sill, the wax on the inn's table, the shoes pressed into damp grass. Each piece lay scattered like bones waiting to be joined. But for now, the silence of Saint-Mesmin held its secret, and Maigret, heavy-shouldered and patient, allowed the weight of it to settle upon him, knowing that silence itself often proved the loudest witness of all. The canal ran parallel to the Seine for a stretch, its surface flat as a mirror when the fog allowed one to see it. Along its banks crouched warehouses with paint peeling, barges tied up with ropes thick as arms, and the odour of coal, oil, and stagnant water rising together into an air already heavy with damp. Maigret walked slowly there with Janvier, coat collar turned up, pipe clenched unlit between his teeth. The ground was soft, rutted by wheels and boots, yet the place had its rhythm, the quiet slap of water against wood, the distant creak of a pulley, the muttered curses of men working though their shapes were swallowed by mist. Rumour lived easily in such places. Words carried down the towpath faster than barges, reshaped with each telling, always heavier, never lighter. That morning, the men moved warily when they saw the commissaire. Shoulders stiffened, eyes slid aside. Each looked as though he had nothing to tell and feared he might be asked anyway. Janvier greeted them in his bright, respectful way, the manner of youth that disarms suspicion. But Maigret's presence was different, solid, slow, inevitable, the kind of presence that made silence itself restless. At the lock-house, a boy barely 20 leaned against the gate, cap pulled low, chewing on a straw. He straightened when the commissaire approached, his nervousness betrayed by the quick shift of his eyes to the water. "You're looking for Larcher," he said, as though to speak the name quickly might get rid of it. "What do you know of him?" Maigret asked. "Only what everyone says," the boy muttered. "That he was seen here 2 nights ago near the Rochard barge. Some say they quarrelled, others say they shook hands. It depends which ear you listen with." "You saw them?" The boy flushed. "I thought I did. The fog was thick. There was talking, then nothing. When I went closer, the place was empty. The dog barked from the yard. That much I'm sure of. I didn't linger. It isn't wise to linger when men talk business in the fog." Maigret let the silence hang until the boy shifted, uncomfortable. "And who told you it was Larcher?" "Everyone," he said again, more stubbornly now. By morning, everyone knew. The commissaire walked on, pipe heavy in his mouth, his eyes moving from the water to the barges moored, along the quay. One bore the name Jeanne-Marie in fading paint, another Marie-Claire, another simply Prosper, as if irony were a kind of talisman. The men aboard moved slowly, loading sacks of flour, their boots crunching on planks dusted white. Each kept his face turned down, avoiding the Paris inspector's gaze. They stopped at Rochard's barge. The man himself sat on a crate, his vast body hunched, hands folded like stone blocks. He did not rise when Maigret and Janvier came. His eyes were small, wary, as if expecting a blow. "You were seen with Larcher," Maigret said, standing over him. "Seen by whom?" Rochard asked. "By those who prefer not to linger." The big man spat into the water. "Then they saw fog. A man cannot argue with fog. I was here. I drink. I sleep. I wake. Ask my woman." "We will," Maigret replied, unruffled. "But tell me, Rochard, if you hated him, why meet him? And if you didn't, why let people say so?" The bargeman's mouth twisted. "Because in a small town, commissaire, silence is heavier than lies. If I deny, they think I killed him. If I admit, they think I did it anyway. Best to let them talk until they tire. Words cost less than beer." Janvier wrote quickly, but Maigret only studied the man with the slow, heavy gaze that unsettled more than sharp questioning. He puffed at his pipe, unlit, as though testing the patience of the air itself. "The dog barked," he said at last. Rochard's shoulders twitched. "Dogs bark at shadows, they bark at rats, at wind, at things men cannot see. Better to trust silence than barking." They left him there, a hulking figure in fog, as if rooted to the spot. At the Canal Café, rumour had already taken firmer shape. Men hunched at tables whispered that Larcher had owed money to a miller in Boissy, that he had been carrying cash for a deal that never happened, that he had been seen boarding a barge bound south, that he had never reached it because the river had claimed him. Each man told it differently, yet each spoke with conviction. In the fog, truth spread like smoke, impossible to seize, clinging to every sleeve. Maigret drank a glass of beer that was warm and sour, more ritual than refreshment. He let them speak, let the tide of words wash over him. The bark of the dog came back to him, sharp, unrelenting. The dog barked not at rumour but at something present, something men had not wished to name. As he rose to leave, one old bargeman, white beard damp with condensation, caught his sleeve. "Commissaire," he whispered, breath sour with wine, "they say Rochard carried something heavy that night, wrapped in sacking, threw it on his barge, then sat on it like a king on a throne. He told the men it was coal, but coal does not bleed water like that." His eyes darted, frightened of his own words. "I say nothing, I drink, I forget, but a dog does not forget." Maigret nodded once, pressed a coin into the man's palm, and left without a word. Outside, the fog pressed tighter, and the canal seemed to close around its secrets. By the time they returned to the station, news had grown again. Pommier met them with fresh whispers. "They say Larcher kept papers at the mill, receipts, accounts. The miller swears he has none of them, but others claim to have seen Larcher carrying ledgers 2 nights ago. Where are they now?" Maigret stood in the telegraph office, pipe lit at last, smoke curling thick and blue. He said nothing for a long while, then finally, "The ledgers, the valise, the empty room, the bark of a dog, these are not rumours. These are facts that wait." And as he spoke, the horn of a barge sounded again on the river, long and mournful, as if echoing some truth hidden beneath the fog that wrapped the town of Saint-Mesmin in its damp embrace. It began with a headline in a Paris evening sheet, the kind hawked at street corners with more flourish than accuracy. "Businessman vanishes in river fog." The words leapt out in bold print, sharpened by the imagination of a journalist who had never seen Saint-Mesmin, never smelled the damp walls of the canal warehouses, never heard the bark of the dog that would not be still. Yet the story was already bigger than the town. By the next morning, other papers followed, each reshaping the silence into paragraphs of speculation. Some called Larcher a financier, others a petty trader. Some had him fleeing debts, others accused of schemes in the mills. In their hands, the fog itself became a character, treacherous, complicit, swallowing evidence. At the Quai des Orfèvres, The pile of papers arrived before Maigret did. Lucas had spread them on the desk, shaking his head at the absurdities. "One has him shot in a lover's quarrel," he muttered. "Another says he was last seen in Montmartre with a dancer. A third claims he left for Belgium with a suitcase of money. They can't even agree on his height." Maigret grunted, lowering himself into his chair, pipe stem clamped between his teeth. He turned one sheet over, slowly, scanning the familiar tricks of ink. Phrases like, "according to reliable sources," "it is said," "our correspondent reports." Nothing but rumour, given uniform. Yet he knew better than to dismiss it. The press had a way of forcing cases open, dragging into daylight what investigators preferred to keep in shadow. Sometimes it frightened a witness into speech. More often, it muddied water already dark. By noon, reporters thronged the quay. They were young men mostly, faces sharpened by hunger for words, coats damp from the mist, notebooks already crowded with inventions. They fired questions like shots. "Is it true he owed 30,000 francs? Did the wife confess? Have you dredged the river? Is Rochard under arrest?" Maigret puffed smoke in answer, eyes half closed, saying nothing. His silence infuriated them, but also made better copy, for a taciturn commissaire allowed them to imagine the rest. Back here. In Saint-Mesmin, the effect was immediate. The café filled with men reading aloud the lines that concerned them, exaggerating them further with each retelling. Madame Piquet bristled when the paper called her in, a notorious rendezvous. Ravot slammed his ledger shut when he was accused of financial quarrels with the missing man. Rochard, his name printed in black, grew more sullen, his silence now interpreted as guilt, and Hélène Maury, though unnamed, was described in one sheet as a woman of mystery, which in small-town mouths meant exactly what it always meant. Madame Larcher read nothing. She sat in her parlour, shutters drawn, sewing with mechanical precision, while neighbours brought clippings folded neatly, as though the printed word had power to conjure her husband back. She thanked them in a voice that revealed nothing, placed the papers aside without unfolding them, and stitched her seams tighter, her thread pulled with a force that betrayed her restraint. Maigret returned to Saint-Mesmin that afternoon, pipe smoke trailing as he stepped from the train. The station felt different now, less like a provincial halt and more like a stage under scrutiny. Men loitered not for travel but for gossip, eyes hungry for the man from Paris who might embody the story. He ignored them, heavy-footed as ever, and went straight to Pommier's office. "They won't stop talking," the station-master said, before the commissaire spoke a word. "The journalists called me last night from Paris. How they found my number, I do not know. They asked if I had seen blood on the tracks, if the lamp was still warm, if the dog barked at the same hour every night. One even asked if Madame Larcher has a lover." His face burned with indignation. "Do they think this is theatre?" Maigret filled his pipe, tamped it, and lit it with deliberate calm. "For them it is. For us it is work." The newspapers forced doors open that had been closed. That evening, two men approached Janvier at the inn, lowering their voices to confide. One claimed to have seen Larcher near the canal days before the disappearance, speaking with a stranger in a bowler hat. The other swore he had overheard a quarrel between Larcher and a mill clerk about missing invoices. Neither would have spoken without the press's appetite, for rumour gave them courage, or vanity, or both. Maigret listened, expression unreadable, pipe smoke veiling his thoughts. He knew such confessions had to be sifted, most of them worthless chaff. Yet sometimes the smallest kernel hid among them, carried by vanity, waiting for a patient hand to recognize its weight. The next morning, the Paris press sent a photographer. His bulky camera, perched on a tripod like an ungainly bird, drew a crowd by the canal bridge. He photographed the fog, the dog, the inn, even Madame Piquet's frown as she carried crates. He tried to photograph Madame Larcher too, but she shut the door in his face. The image that appeared in the next edition showed only her shuttered house with the caption, "Where Silence Reigns." By the third day, the papers had christened it "The Case of the Barking Dog." The detail had captured their imagination. They embroidered it freely, making the dog clairvoyant, loyal, tragic. One claimed it had guided Maigret to the missing man's shoe. Another, that it howled each night at the very hour of the disappearance. Children in Paris began barking at one another in play, calling it the Larcher game. The commissaire read these lines without amusement, his thick fingers drumming the arm of his chair. The dog had indeed barked, and perhaps it had seen what men had not. But in the hands of journalists it became a spectacle, obscuring rather than clarifying. Yet behind the noise the current of truth moved. The miller at Boissy, stung by insinuations in print, came forward angrily to defend his honour, admitting in the process that he had indeed quarrelled with Larcher about missing ledgers. A bargeman, fearing his name might be printed next, confessed to seeing a bundle thrown aboard Rochard's boat under cover of fog. And Hélène, cornered by whispers too loud to ignore, wept in Madame Piquet's kitchen, protesting that she had never harmed Larcher, that he was kind to her in a way no man had been, that if he was gone, it was not by her doing. Maigret listened to each, heavy and silent, asking few questions. He let their words accumulate like layers of silt at the bottom of the canal. Only when the weight was sufficient would the shape of the truth appear. He understood that the press, with its hunger, had accelerated the current. Now it was his task to sift what was stirred from what had sunk long before. One evening, returning to the inn, he found Janvier reading aloud from a paper to a group of townsfolk. The inspector's young voice carried the printed words with ironic detachment, yet the faces around him listened eagerly, as though each line confirmed what they already believed. When he finished, Maigret took the sheet from his hand, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat. "Enough," he said. "The river does not care what is printed, nor does the fog. Only men and their actions matter." And yet, alone in his room later, he unfolded the paper again and studied the grainy photograph of the dog chained in the station yard, its eyes bright against the mist. He tapped ash into the saucer, pipe clenched tight. The dog barked because it had seen, or sensed, or remembered. And in that persistence lay a clue no article could fabricate away. The case had escaped Saint-Mémin. It now belonged to Paris, to the papers, to rumour stretching its legs across boulevards. But for Maigret the work was the same, to step slowly through fog and silence, to weigh each word against the stubborn reality of a missing man's pipe, a smudged window-sill, and the echo of a bark in the night. The fog in Paris was different from that in near Saint-Mémin. It did not roll in from low fields or river banks, but seeped upward from the Seine itself, mingling with smoke from factories, with coal dust, with the breath of thousands of lives pressed close together. It swelled around bridges, swallowed boulevards, blurred the gas lamps into sickly halos. Maigret returned with Janvier to the Quai des Orfèvres one such evening, the city muffled under its own grey cloak, and felt the curious weight of the case shift. Here, in Paris, it no longer belonged to one missing man and a provincial town. Here the story breathed in cafes and trams, in crowded markets, and over zinc counters, spreading with the same stubborn insistence as the mist itself. At the bureau, Lucas was waiting with reports. "The furnished room on the Rue du Parc Royal," he said, his Paris address, The concierge confirms he kept it, but he has not been seen there in days. His last visit was a week before the disappearance. The room is orderly, too orderly, no papers, no loose clothing, as if it had been cleared. Maigret puffed at his pipe, listening. Neighbours? Polite, curious. They noticed nothing, except an old tailor across the hall swears a young woman visited. He describes her vaguely, dark hair, slim, careful in her step. Could be anyone, could be no one. The commissaire grunted. He had expected as much. Rooms in Paris told lies with their tidiness, just as in Saint-Mesme. He would look himself, but he knew already the place would smell only of absence. That night Maigret went walking, alone, through the Marais. He preferred the city on foot, where every doorway, every window spoke of lives arranged behind it. He paused at the Rue du Parc Royal, studied the façade, the shuttered windows. In a café opposite, men smoked and argued over racing odds, their voices carrying into the street. Faces turned as he entered, curiosity quickening. He ordered nothing, only stood at the counter, pipe unlit, eyes moving slowly over the crowd. He saw her then, Hélène Maury. She was out of place in the city, her provincial dress careful but not Parisian, her face pale, anxious. She sat with a man in a bowler hat, his hands restless on the table, tapping a pack of cigarettes without opening it. They were not speaking, only staring at their cups as though the silence between them were already too loud. When Hélène looked up, her eyes met Maigret's, widened, then dropped. The man beside her muttered something and rose too quickly, leaving coins on the saucer. He slipped out into the fog. Maigret did not follow. He watched Hélène instead. She sat a moment longer, then gathered her gloves with trembling fingers and stood. She walked past him with her head lowered, the smell of cheap perfume trailing faintly. The commissaire did not stop her. He knew fear drove people faster than pursuit. He let her vanish into the mist. The next morning, the papers were full again. One described a mysterious woman in Paris, linked to the case, hinting at scandal, at secret lives. The words spread like wildfire. At the market in Les Halles, Maigret moved among the crowds, the cries of vendors rising around him. Pommes, choux, fresh sardines. The air was sharp with cold fish, with cabbage, with smoke from braziers. He walked slowly, letting the city press close, letting its noise and smell enfold him. Here, faces were endless, shifting, layered, yet each told its story. A miller from Boissy shouting over onions, a bargeman's widow haggling for bread, a young woman with eyes too watchful for someone buying pears. In the tide of the crowd, Maigret felt again that particular tension. Truth hidden not in silence now, but in multiplicity, in the drowning noise of too many voices. Later, in Montparnasse, another café, this one smoky, noisy, with students and writers gesturing wildly over glasses of wine. And yet there, too, were familiar faces. Rochard himself, massive shoulders hunched in a corner, speaking low to a man Maigret did not know, a stranger with a scar across his cheek and the hard stillness of someone who listens more than he speaks. The bargeman raised his glass, drained it, slammed it down. The scarred man leaned closer. Their eyes flicked up when the commissaire entered, but Maigret pretended not to see. He took a place at the counter, ordered a beer, and smoked. He could feel them watching him, uneasy, knowing his presence shifted the balance of their words. When at last Rochard rose to leave, Maigret followed at a distance. The big man lumbered through the fog, muttering, shoulders swaying. At a corner he paused, looked around, then melted into a narrow alley. Maigret did not pursue. He knew the rhythm of these men. Sooner or later, they always circled back to their boats, to the water that held them. The days passed, and Paris itself seemed complicit in the case. Everywhere Maigret turned, faces surfaced from the fog, Hélène slipping from one café to another, Rochard looming in unexpected quarters, even Madame Piquet once, carrying a basket through the Gare de Lyon as though she had business far from her inn. Each encounter was brief, inconclusive, like glimpses in a mirror. Yet together they suggested a web, strands stretching from Saint-Mesmin into the very heart of the city. One evening, crossing the Pont Neuf, Maigret stopped at the parapet. The river moved sluggishly below, flecked with patches of light from the lamps. The water smelled of damp stone, coal, and the faint rot of leaves. He leaned on the rail, pipe smoke curling, and thought of the dog's bark echoing in Saint-Mesmin. A dog does not bark at rumour, it barks at presence. Somewhere among these faces in the crowd, among these voices in cafes and markets, lay the presence that had unsettled the animal. Janvier joined him, his young face eager, uncertain. "Chief," he said, "they're everywhere, in Paris, in the papers, in the markets. How can we sift them all?" Maigret did not answer at once. He drew on his pipe, exhaled, watched the smoke mingle with the fog. "You sift by weight," he said at last. "The faces that return, the names that repeat, the silences that grow louder, those are the ones that matter." And as the river rolled beneath them, and the lamps burned weakly against the fog, Maigret felt the crowd itself close in, a multitude of eyes and whispers pressing on him. Each face was a possibility, each silence a clue. But one face, one silence, would not let go. The night air clung with dampness, thick with fog, so dense it seemed to coat the skin like a thin film of river water. In the yard of the Saint-Mesmin station, the chain rattled faintly as Médor strained, nostrils wide, eyes bright in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. He barked once, then twice, each cry cutting through the muffled quiet like a blade through cloth. The sound echoed, startling a pigeon from the eaves, then silence again, except for the restless growl that trembled in the dog's throat. Maigret stood at the edge of the yard, shoulders hunched beneath his heavy overcoat, pipe stem clenched in his teeth. He had not come here by chance. Something in him, perhaps no more than a policeman's instinct sharpened by years of smoke-filled corridors and confessions whispered in half-light, had told him to leave Paris behind for a night and return where it had begun, to the station where the fog first swallowed Victor Larcher. And the dog, with his stubborn refusal to forget, seemed almost to have been waiting. Pommier emerged from the office, pulling his coat tighter. "He's been like this 3 nights running," the station master muttered. "Always at the same hour. I tell myself it's the barges shifting, or a fox by the sheds, but he knows better, doesn't he, commissaire?" The commissaire did not answer. He walked slowly toward the dog, boots crunching on the damp gravel. Médor stiffened, barked again, then sniffed, ears twitching. His chain pulled taut in the direction of the coal shed. The lamp inside was unlit now, but the memory of its warmth lingered in Maigret's mind, the detail that had never settled. He stooped, stroked the dog's back, then straightened and opened the shed door. Inside, the darkness smelled of kerosene, coal dust, damp wood. The commissaire stood motionless, listening. The silence pressed like weight. Then he saw it, the faint trace of scuff marks near the far wall, where sacks had been shifted. He bent, touched the floor, his broad fingers coming away with a smear of soot and something else, waxy, faint but unmistakable. Candle grease hardened into the cracks. Janvier, who had followed quietly, leaned over his shoulder. "A meeting place, Chief." or a waiting place, Maigret murmured. He lit his pipe, the glow casting brief shadows on the shed's walls. A dog does not bark at empty corners, he barks at footsteps that return. They left the shed, the dog, whining softly as though demanding to be followed further. The commissaire stood a long moment in the yard, smoke rising around his head. "We will watch," he said finally. "Not by day, by night, when silence grows careless." That night they took positions near the station, lamps doused, the fog their ally. Pommier remained inside, uneasy, while Maigret and Janvier waited in the cold, listening to the river's faint breath beyond the town. Hours stretched. The dog lay restless, ears twitching, eyes fixed toward the coal shed. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock. Somewhere in the village a shutter banged, and then Médor barked, sharp, insistent. Out of the fog a figure moved, slow, cautious, wrapped in a heavy coat. The man paused, looked about, then slipped toward the shed. He carried something in his hand, a lantern dimly lit, its glow shielded. Maigret held up a hand to still Janvier, who was tensed to move. They watched as the figure entered the shed, closed the door behind him. A moment later, light seeped through the cracks in the boards. The commissaire stepped forward, heavy but silent, his bulk blending with the night. At the door he waited, listening. The scrape of a crate being moved, the faint clink of metal. Then, unmistakable, the creak of a ledger being opened. Maigret pushed the door wide. The man spun, lantern raised, eyes wide. It was Ravot, the cafe keeper, his face flushed, sweat glistening though the night was cold. In his hands lay a book, one of the missing ledgers. He froze under Maigret's gaze. "So," the commissaire said, voice low, steady, "you came to feed the dog's memory." Ravot stammered, "It's not what you think, I only kept them safe. Slarcher asked me." His words tangled, broke apart. Maigret took the book, heavy with ink and figures, the pages smudged by hurried hands. He leafed through it, the pipe smoke curling over the columns of debts and names, numbers, dates, shipments. But more than that, signatures, initials, transactions with the mills, with Rochard, with men who preferred to remain unnamed. "Safe," Maigret repeated. He closed the ledger with a snap that echoed in the small shed. "Safe for whom?" Ravot's eyes darted. He was afraid. He gave them to me the night before he vanished. Said if anything happened, I should hide them. I swear it, commissaire. I didn't harm him. I only—" The dog barked again, fierce, as though calling out the lie. Ravot flinched. Maigret leaned closer, his heavy face unreadable. "Why hide them here in the shed? Why come back in the night to look?" The cafe keeper licked his lips. "Because the papers in Paris, because they said I quarrelled with him. I thought if they searched my cafe, they'd find them. I had to move them. Please, you understand?" The commissaire said nothing. He closed the lantern, dousing the light, and led the man out into the fog. The dog followed with low growls, chain rattling, eyes bright. At the station office, under the yellow glow of the kerosene lamp, Ravot sat hunched, face grey with fear. Janvier took notes, his pencil scratching steadily. Maigret stood by the stove, pipe in hand, staring at the ledger. "You say he feared," Maigret said at last. "Feared what?" Ravot hesitated. "Debts, enemies. Rochard, yes, but others too. He said there were men who would not forgive. He did not name them. He only pressed the books on me and said, 'If I do not come tomorrow, keep them safe.' And then? And then he vanished. That's all." Maigret drew in smoke, exhaled slowly. He thought of the empty room, the pipe on the table, the smudge on the windowsill. He thought of Hélène's pale eyes in the Paris café, of Rochard's silence, of the forged note at the telegraph office. The pieces shifted in his mind, arranging themselves not into clarity, yet but into a shape, a shadow almost seen. He closed the ledger, slid it into his coat. "You will remain available," he told Ravoud. The words were flat, but they carried weight. Outside, the fog pressed closer, thicker than before. The dog barked once more, then fell silent at last, as though its duty had been fulfilled. Maigret stood in the yard, listening to the night. The ledger was heavy under his arm. The case was no longer only about a missing man. It was about numbers, names, debts, and the silence that hung over them like fog on the river. But still, the bark of the dog lingered in his mind, sharp and insistent, as if warning that the truth was not yet reached, that the night still held secrets waiting to be pulled from its damp embrace. The fog that blanketed Saint-Mémin had settled into the kind of night that held its breath. The stars were obscured, the river's murmur muffled by the dense air. Yet beneath the soft whisper of the fog, Maigret stood, feeling the pulse of the town like a heartbeat under his boots. He had spent the day piecing together fragments, Ravoud's confession, the dog's unrelenting bark, the ledger now safely tucked in his coat. But the case was no longer only a matter of missing papers or a man who had stepped too lightly into the mist. It had become a matter of silences. There was something more in this place, something hidden in plain sight. The town had changed since the morning. The rumours had thickened into suspicion, and Maigret could feel the weight of eyes on him as he walked down the narrow streets. People had begun to look at each other more carefully, as if the shadows had grown longer and closer. He passed familiar faces now more warily, noticing the way they glanced over their shoulders, the way their hands lingered just a moment too long on doorways. Their eyes followed him as though they could see through the fog, as if they knew he was close to something they feared but could not name. He had gone to the Larcher house again that evening. Madame Larcher was seated by the window, eyes unblinking as she stared into the dark. She had said little to him since that first meeting, but Maigret had come to understand her silence better than any words. It was a silence full of grief, but also full of calculation. As though somewhere beneath her stillness she was waiting for something to happen, or for someone to speak what she already knew. "I don't think he's coming back," she had said softly that evening. "But I want you to find him anyway." Those words lingered in the air, long after Maigret had left her house and walked back into the fog, his thoughts more confused than before. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that she knew something. She had known for days, perhaps weeks, that something had been wrong. Something had slipped quietly into their lives and shifted the air, as though someone had entered their home and touched the things they had long taken for granted. Now, with the ledger in his hands, Maigret had the answer he had been waiting for. The case was no longer a mystery of one man's disappearance. It was a network of debts, silent threats, and promises broken too quickly to be kept. At the edge of the river, the fog clung to the water's surface like a thin sheet of paper. The boats were docked, the bargemen silent under their covers, their lanterns flickering faintly in the distance. The station master's yard was empty, save for the dog, who sat with his back stiff, watching the water. Maigret stood there for a long time, the only movement the ripple of his pipe smoke as it swirled up and disappeared into the thick air. He could feel it now, the weight of the silence that had hung around Larcher, around Ravoud, and now around him. It was as though the river itself had swallowed everything and was waiting for someone to remember what it had taken. In the distance, the sound of a barge horn echoed, low and mournful. The fog blurred the shape of the boat, its outline uncertain, but it felt as though it were moving directly toward him, the sound of the engine throbbing against the silence. "Why does the dog bark so much?" Janvier had asked earlier that day. "He's as anxious as we are." Maigret had smiled, though it wasn't a smile for comfort. "Dogs bark when they see something we don't." And then, without another word, they had watched the dog, whose patience seemed to stretch just as long as theirs, waiting for the moment when the fog would finally let them see what had been hidden in its depths. The river was not clear, not here, not now, but it was a river that gave up its secrets slowly, the way the mist lifted just enough to let the occasional shadow of something long submerged break the surface. Maigret pulled his collar tighter, the dampness of the air soaking through the fabric of his coat. He turned and began walking back toward the town, past the closed shutters of the houses, past the whispers that lingered in the streets. The night had deepened, but there was no peace in it, only a faint sense of things still in motion, still circling, just beyond his reach. At the station, Pommier was waiting for him, as he had been for the last few days. The station master's face was drawn with fatigue, the weight of the rumours pressing in on him. "I've spoken to the miller again," Pommier said quietly, as if sharing a secret. "He insists there's nothing more, but I can see it in his eyes. He knows something. He's too nervous." Maigret nodded, rubbing his temple, feeling the weight of the case pressing deeper. "What about the bargeman?" "They're as tight-lipped as the rest of them. But the big man Rochard, he's been asking about the newspapers, asking if anything's been printed about him. I've seen him look at the telegrams. I think he's afraid they'll find something." "Let him be afraid," Maigret said softly. "Let them all be afraid. They're hiding something, and they know they'll be found out." They stood together in the yard, watching as the lanterns of the barges flickered against the river. In the distance, the river felt full, bloated with everything that had been pushed into it, with everything that had been hidden beneath its surface. Maigret's thoughts drifted back to the ledger, the numbers, the debts, the names. Each line held a promise, a failure, and a consequence. Each signature was a mark left on the world, an indelible trace of who owed what and who was willing to pay. But Larcher was gone, and the river had swallowed him. Whatever debts he had carried, whatever promises he had broken, they were now lost in the fog. Only the dog remained, barking at the unknown, waiting for Maigret to piece together what was left. "I'll go back to the mill," Pommier said, breaking the silence. "I'll ask again. Maybe this time he'll tell me something." Maigret nodded, though he knew the answer would be the same. The pieces were scattered, the threads tangled. The case had slipped past them all, just as Larcher had slipped from his own life. The man had become a shadow, a reflection in the fog, but still something had been left behind. The ledger, the bark of the dog, the quiet corner of the shed. It was all a message, an invitation to find what had been hidden. "Not yet," Maigret said, voice low, steady. "It's not time. We wait a little longer." Pommier looked at him, puzzled. "Wait for what, Chief?" "For the river to give up its secrets." Maigret's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in days he felt the stirrings of certainty. "And for the man who has been watching from the shadows to step into the light." He turned slowly, walking back toward the station, his heavy footsteps muffled by the mist. The fog still clung to the town, and the dog sat motionless by the gate, watching him with a strange kind of knowing. There was something in the air now, something shifting, and Maigret knew it was only a matter of time before the final piece fell into place.